World News Program coming to you live from Algiers. I'm Miriam Zien, and these are the headlines. Iran announces agreement with Oman to share Strait of Hormuz revenues as President Pezeshkian says Washington will gain nothing from economic pressure. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio rules out new strikes on Iran for the time being. Coming up next, the UN condemns settler crimes in the West Bank as Hamas warns settlement expansion paves the way for annexation and displacement. And U.S. organizations urge the Congress to intervene to halt attacks in Qusra. Madrid activates national security mechanism for the first time amid the Ceuta crisis, and Moroccan activists slam Zionist plan as source of threat to the security and stability of the entire region. Welcome back. First, in our news, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said on Wednesday that Iran and Oman have reached agreements on sharing revenues from vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This new news agency quoted IRGC spokesman Hossein Mohabbi as saying that the Strait of Hormuz belongs to Iran and Oman, adding that negotiations between the two countries began about a month ago and produced acceptable results. Mohabbi also accused the United States of obstructing the negotiations, causing their delay.
The Strait of Hormuz is shared by Iran and the Sultanate of Oman, which lies opposite us. We began negotiations with Oman about a month ago. We have reached an agreement acceptable to both sides, including an understanding on each country's share of the Strait's waters and the distribution of its revenues between Iran and Oman. The United States is obstructing this route, which is what has caused the delay. If the United States ends its obstruction and returns to the Memorandum of Understanding, we can reopen the Strait of Hormuz in accordance with the agreement reached. Therefore, the United States must accept our terms. If it does not, the Strait of Hormuz will not be reopened under any circumstances.
Iran has warned that the Strait of Hormuz will not be reopened unless the United States ends the war. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi said on Wednesday that no military vessel would be allowed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian military said the areas east of the Strait of Hormuz, the northern Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the Gulf of Oman are under its operational control. In a statement on Wednesday, the Iranian military said its naval forces were monitoring vessel movements hundreds of kilometers before they reached the Strait of Hormuz, reiterating that ships must obtain permission from Iranian authorities to transit the waterway. And the military added that the Iranian naval forces had suffered damage during the recent confrontations, but said they had succeeded in preventing enemy military vessels from approaching Iranian shores. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said the economic measures taken by Tehran are preventing the United States from gaining leverage from the economic pressure imposed on Iran at this stage. In remarks carried by Iran's ISNA news agency, Pezeshkian stressed that his country's approach is based on understanding and resolving issues through negotiations, while emphasizing that Tehran would respond firmly to any economic pressure targeting Iran. And Iran has called on all governments to reject and condemn measures taken by the United States against Tehran. During a UN Security Council meeting on conflicts, food security, and the Council's role addressing the food crisis on Tuesday evening, Iran's ambassador and deputy permanent representative to the United Nations, Ghulam Hossein Dagani, warned of the consequences of the U.S. campaign aimed at exerting economic pressure on Iran. Axios reported that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has told several counterparts from allied countries in recent days that the United States is not expected to launch new strikes on Iran for the time being. The website, citing a U.S. official and another informed source, both unnamed, reported on Tuesday that the United States would focus on other forms of pressure instead of potentially launching new strikes against Iran. Russia stressed that the U.S. and Zionist aggression against Iran has created what it called a logistical shock whose repercussions extend beyond the Middle East. During a UN Security Council meeting on conflicts, food security, and the Council's role in addressing the food crisis on Tuesday, Russia's ambassador and permanent representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, warned that tens of thousands or tens of millions of people could face the risk of a hunger as a result.
The organizers of today's debate propose to consider these topics in a broader angle through the impact of regional conflicts on global food markets and supply chains. And if we discuss the problem this way, we cannot ignore the most obvious and the most topical example, the aggression unleashed on February 28th by the United States and Israel against Iran.
The United Nations said crimes committed by Zionist settlers against civilians in the occupied West Bank are continuing under the full protection of occupation forces with no accountability. Speaking at the UN Security Council on Wednesday, the UN Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Ramiz Al-Akbarov, said the situation in the West Bank is catastrophic, describing the E1 plan as an attempt to divide the Palestinian state into separate parts, in clear violation international law.
The situation in the West Bank remains dire. Large-scale settler attacks continue with virtually no accountability for these crimes. Israeli security forces have frequently failed to protect Palestinians from settler attacks and, in some cases, have reportedly facilitated or participated in such violence. Israel, as the occupying power, must ensure that the civilian population is protected and perpetrators are held to account.
And for his part, Palestine's permanent representative to the United Nations, Riyad Mansour, said in his briefing that the Zionist occupation has crossed every red line, with its officials speaking the full and comprehensive annexation of Palestinian territory with the aim of destroying the Palestinian state and undermining any peace process.
Annexation has long been underway, but Israel has now crossed the Rubicon when it comes to full-fledged, full-blown annexation with the release of the tenders for E1 plan. The Israeli government stated clearly that its goal in issuing these tenders was the destruction of the Palestinian state and the triumph of the settler state. This is in parallel with the settlers' violence terrorizing the Palestinian population that the Israeli government has helped unleash, is refusing to control, and continues to effectively support.
And the Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Hussein Ibrahim Taha, condemned the storming and evacuation by Zionist occupation forces of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees UNRWA compound in Qalantiya, north of occupied Al-Quds, describing it as a dangerous escalation in attacks on the UN agency and its facilities. In a statement on Tuesday, Taha warned that continued attacks on UN institutions, particularly UNRWA, threaten the Palestinian refugee cause and rights while worsening their humanitarian suffering. He stressed that the agency plays an essential and irreplaceable role in providing education, healthcare, relief, and social services to Palestinian refugees. The Arab League Secretariat expressed deep concern over the continued violations committed by the Israeli occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories, stressing that they target civilians, journalists, and humanitarian institutions and undermine the protection guaranteed under international law. In a statement on Wednesday, marking the first anniversary of the Zionist bombing of Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, which killed 5 Palestinian journalists, the Arab League said the occupation's continued violations a year after the tragic incident reflect the persistence of policies and practices that put civilians and media workers at risk. U.S. organizations have called on members of the Congress to hold the Israeli occupation accountable and pressure it to halt settler attacks against Palestinians trapped in their homes in Khusra, south of Nablus, including U.S. citizens. Human rights groups have launched a campaign urging Americans to contact their representatives and demand action against settlers involved in violence and land seizures. They said the attacks in Khusra are part of a broader escalation in settler violence and settlement expansion across the West Bank, calling on the U.S. administration and Congress to take concrete steps to protect Palestinians, including U.S. citizens. And the Palestinian Hamas movement said the occupation's expansion of settlement areas in the West Bank is part of a policy aimed at annexation, forced displacement, and the seizure of more Palestinian land. In a statement on Wednesday, it warned that escalating land confiscations could depopulate areas, fragment the West Bank, and turn it into isolated enclaves, stressing that settlement projects grant the occupation no legal right or sovereignty over Palestinian territory.
The occupation's settlement plans and attempts to impose a reality of annexation and displacement will be shattered by the steadfastness and resilience of our people and their adherence to their land and rights. Our people who have faced decades of occupation and aggression will not relinquish their land, and the occupation's crimes and brutality will not succeed in uprooting them from it or breaking their will. We call on the international community to assume its responsibilities and not merely condemn this brutal settlement expansion, but to work to hold the occupation accountable, halt its settlement projects, and compel it to respect international laws and resolutions.
And Gaza's health ministry said hospitals in the Strip received the bodies of 7 victims over the past 24 hours, including 5 newly killed Palestinians and 2 who died from their injuries, as well as 10 wounded. In a statement on Wednesday, the ministry said the death toll since the ceasefire on October 11 had risen to 1,303, while the number of wounded reached 4,336, in addition to 814 bodies recovered from under the rubble. In the same context, Algeria renewed its call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and unrestricted humanitarian access, warning against the use of hunger as a weapon of war. Speaking at a high-level UN Security Council debate on food crises, Algeria's Deputy Permanent Representative Ambassador Mehdi Litim described Gaza's humanitarian catastrophe as an open and bleeding wound, noting that around 1.4 million people continue to face acute food insecurity, according to the latest IPC data.
In Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe remains an open, unhealed wound. The latest IPC data highlights a dire reality in which 1.4 million people continue to face acute food insecurity. Famine conditions previously identified in Gaza illustrate the devastating toll of using hunger as a weapon of war. Children are dying of malnutrition, while life-saving aid trucks are blocked just miles away. Algeria reiterates its call for an immediate ceasefire and the unrestricted entry of humanitarian relief.
The Algerian State Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, arrived in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia on Wednesday on President Abdelmajid Tebboun's instruction to attend the 23rd extraordinary session of the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers on Thursday. According to the Algerian Foreign Ministry, the session is expected to elect a new OIC Secretary General to succeed Hossein Brahim Taha and discuss the latest developments in the Palestinian cause, particularly the ongoing Zionist aggression and violations in Gaza and the West Bank, including occupied Al-Quds. U.S. Special Envoy to Syria Ambassador to Turkey Tom Barrack described the decision to dissolve the Syrian Democratic Forces as historic. In a post on X, Barrack said the move opens the way for President Donald Trump to facilitate the orderly integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces into Syria's state institutions. He said this could turn past divisions into a lasting partnership, allowing Syrians to shape their shared future while strengthening state sovereignty through one army, one government, and one state. In other news, the wave of mass arrivals of Moroccan illegal migrants into the Spanish city of Ceuta has prompted Madrid to invoke for the first time the national security interest mechanism, reflecting the scale of the crisis. The decision followed the Tuesday meeting of Spain's National Security Council chaired by Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez to assess the impact of the late July influx, which put pressure on reception services, infrastructure, and security. A unified command has been established to coordinate the response. And according to EFE, the mechanism had never previously been used and allows authorities to centrally mobilize government resources during severe and urgent crises. Moroccan activists opposed to normalization with the Zionist entity stressed that the Zionist project remains a threat to security and stability in the Arab and Islamic region and to international peace. In a statement on Tuesday, the National Action Group for Palestine said normalization serves neither Morocco's interests nor regional security, condemning visits by occupation officials and rejecting all forms of political, economic, cultural, and security normalization, including resumed air links. The group also expressed solidarity with citizens detained or restricted over their participation in peaceful protests. And Niger's Prime Minister Ali Lamin Zain arrived in Algeria on Wednesday evening at the head of a high-level delegation for a two-day working visit aimed at strengthening bilateral cooperation and partnership. Zain was received upon his arrival at Houari Bimoudine International Airport by Algerian Prime Minister Sifir Rayeb, accompanied by several government members. According to the Prime Minister's office, the visit reflects growing momentum in bilateral ties and the shared determination of Presidents Abdelmajid Tebboune and General Abdurrahman Tayani to give them fresh impetus and build a renewed partnership supporting development, stability, and regional integration in Africa. Algerian President Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune received on Wednesday the President of the Independent National Electoral Authority, Saïd Arous, according to a statement from the Algerian presidency. Algeria warned during an open UN Security Council session of the worsening food insecurity crisis in Sudan, calling for an end to the fighting and ensuring humanitarian aid reaches millions of people affected by the conflict. Algeria's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, Ambassador Mehdi Litim, said Sudan is facing one of the world's largest emergencies linked to acute food insecurity. He noted that 19.5 million people, or around 41% of Sudan's population, are facing high levels of food insecurity.
Turning to Sudan, the country faces one of the largest acute food insecurity emergencies globally. According to the latest IPC analysis, 19.5 million people, nearly 41% of the population, now face high levels of acute food insecurity. Most alarmingly, 135,000 individuals are trapped in Phase 5, enduring starvation, while 825,000 children suffer from severe acute malnutrition. conflict-driven restriction on humanitarian access, deliberate attacks on supply routes, and the destruction of food production systems continue to prevent aid from reaching those most in need.
And instructed by the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, the Minister of the Interior and Local Authorities and Transport, Saïd Sayoud, arrived in the province of Béjaïa on Wednesday evening to oversee the firefighting operations that broke out in several municipalities, according to a statement issued by the Ministry of the Interior, Local Authorities and Transport. The same source indicated that Mr. Sayoud was accompanied by the Minister of Health, Mr. Mohammed Sadiq Ait Masoudan, the Director General of National Security, Mr. Ali Badawi, and the Director General of Civil Protection, Colonel Boualam Bouhallouf, to personally assess the progress of the firefighting operations, review the efforts of the intervention teams, and check on the health of the injured. It is also worth noting that 12 people died as a result of fires that broke out in many provinces of eastern Algeria. The Russian-Ukrainian file, the governor of the Russian-controlled part of the Luhansk region, Leonid Pazenhik, said 9 people were killed after Ukrainian shelling struck a bus in the region. Pazenhik said the bus was traveling from Lysychansk and Kadivka when it came under fire. Russia's defense ministry said on Wednesday that its air defense systems intercepted and destroyed 426 Ukrainian drones overnight over various regions within what Moscow calls its special military operation. According to the ministry, the drones were neutralized over the regions of Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, Oryol, Kaluga, Tula, Lipetsk, Voronezh, Tambov, Ryazan, Nizhny Novgorod, and Volgograd, Rostov, Moscow, and Krasnodar, as well as Crimea. A rare and discreet visit to Moscow by CIA Director John Ratcliffe has raised questions of the possible secret talks between Washington and Moscow with the Ukraine war, prisoner exchanges in Iran among the issues that may have been discussed. Nestin Eric has the report.
The director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, John Ratcliffe, made a discreet visit to Moscow for talks with senior Russian security officials, a rare encounter that has raised questions about the possible agenda and implications of the meeting. Ratcliffe's flight was tracked by the Wall Street Journal. After a stop in Latvia, his aircraft landed in Moscow, where the CIA director remained for around 4 hours before departing. The meeting was held behind closed doors, with neither side publicly disclosing details of the discussions. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov nevertheless confirmed that contacts between Russian and U.S. security services continue despite the severe deterioration in bilateral relations.
Contacts between the security services are in themselves a positive development and constructive process. Such contacts often continue even during the most difficult periods in bilateral relations. However, it is still too early to say to what extent they will ultimately help move our bilateral relations out of the deep crisis they are currently facing.
The war in Ukraine is widely seen as one possible subject of the talks. Observers have also suggested that prisoner exchanges may have been discussed, given the CIA's previous involvement in negotiations that contributed to the release of an American journalist in 2024. Another possible area of discussion is Iran, where Moscow retains significant influence and where Washington may seek Russian cooperation on regional issues.
From running an investigation.
For now, however, the substance of the Moscow meeting remains unclear, yet the fact that senior officials continue to engage behind the scenes suggests that, despite the public tensions, some channels between Washington and Moscow remain open and may carry significance beyond what has been publicly disclosed.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has tasked members of his cabinet with preparing proposals to address the EU-China trade imbalance, saying Berlin will announce its position on the issue in October. Merz said Germany is targeting economic growth of more than 1% next year, after 3 years of stagnation, pointing to improving economic prospects and rising business confidence. And on a latter note, and finally, robots have taken to the field in Beijing, China, to compete in their own games, running, playing football, and testing the limits of what machines can do. What may look like a novelty is also becoming a glimpse of how quickly robotics is moving into the real world. Nabil Khazini has more details.
The starting line looks familiar, the track, the cheering crowds, the tension before the race, but the athletes are something else entirely. The starting gun has sounded for a rather unusual kind of athlete, one built of metal, motors, and lines of code. Inside the ice ribbon, the arena once built for Olympic speed, more than 2,000 humanoid robots have been running, fighting, dancing, and even playing football. The Second World Humanoid Robot Games brought together 2,056 robots from 666 teams across 16 countries, competing in 51 disciplines.
The goal of our company is to turn robots into products. Having the robot run is a way to assess the comprehensiveness of its system, its stability and the explosive power of its joints. It's actually capable of doing many kinds of work that humans do.
And then there is 100 meters. China's Tiangong Ultra has repeatedly rewritten the record here, culminating in a time of just 8.64 seconds. But the spectacle also reveals the limits of these machines. Some robots have struggled to stop after a race, tumbling into padded barriers. And perhaps that is the real test, not just how fast a robot can run, but how well it can handle the unexpected. For China, these games are both sporting spectacle and technological proving ground, a way of testing whether advances in artificial intelligence can acquire a physical form and eventually become useful in workplaces and homes. The robots may be learning how to move like us, but in Beijing, they are also showing us just how difficult it remains to truly master the human art of balance, judgment, and control.
Our newscast has come to an end. Thanks for your kind attention, and have a great night.